Singularity Meetup. Reva asked me, most of you know Reva, to say hello, and she's very disappointed she can't be here. And the reason she's disappointed is we have our most distinguished speaker yet of this group, Professor Pauen from the Humboldt School of Mind and Brain. And yeah, we've got to say thanks to Harry and Hack and Craft for hosting us, keeping us all. And yeah, other than that, there's just a bit about the format. Michael's going to be speaking first for about 45 minutes. And yeah, they can feel free to interject just for clarifications, right?
Yeah.
And then there's question and answer. Yeah,
discussion afterwards.
No red herrings. No red herrings for the first 45 minutes. And then afterwards, as many fish as you like. So yeah, Professor Michael Pauen.
Okay, so, yeah, right, so question for clarification and discussion afterwards, and I make a distinction whether or not the question is a question for clarification or discussion, so otherwise the talk would be too much. Okay, so I talk about, basically, so my talk will have three basic subjects. First I will talk about basically problem of consciousness, neuroscience, and philosophy. Then I will say a few words about freedom, which we will discuss. I won't talk about empirical stuff, but if you're interested, I would be happy to add some experiments that have been done and how to interpret or which consequences follow from those experiments. And in the end, I will share some concerns I have about Kurzweil and singularity. Ideas concerning singularity, that's about intelligence, but also about standards for progress or development. And we'll see. Okay, so as you might more or less already be aware, there's a huge discussion concerning the interaction between neuroscience and philosophy, and recent developments in neuroscience have put a focus on issues that are relevant for human self-understanding. These are issues like consciousness, the self or self-consciousness, or free will. And many neuroscientists have the idea that sooner or later neuroscientists will come up with a solution. And many of those solutions won't be, we won't like those solutions very much because they will show that there is no free will and that there is no self, and maybe we don't even have consciousness. And I would like to show that this is not that simple. So I think that there are no conclusive arguments that we are not conscious. I mean, that seems to be quite obvious, and we won't focus so much on that. But the same goes for free will, so I don't think that there's any conclusive evidence, neither theoretical nor empirical evidence that we are not free. And again, I would also say a few words about the singularity stuff at the end. Now, I think one of the first things that one should be aware of is that there is a basic difference between what philosophers do and what scientists do. That's one of the reasons why scientists can't just solve philosophical problems. And the reason is that what philosophers do, of course, they come up with some historical background, and that's what I'm going to do also. That's sometimes important in order to be aware, or to make you aware of the specific situation we are in. We tend to overgeneralize certain ideas and opinions we have, and just take them for granted. And looking back into history may make us aware that we are just blind in certain aspects, and looking back to history might teach us this. Historical background. Then what's the most important stuff in philosophy are conceptual questions. So if we talk about a certain experiment that seems to show that there is no freedom, well, the first thing we have to know is what do we mean if we talk about freedom? What are the standards? And that's something that you won't find out in an experiment. Typically, you have to know this already. And of course, ethical issues, that's something I won't talk about, but that's also one of the philosophical issues. Empirical, so philosophers come up with standards. What is the standard? What's the standard? Something has to, an action has to be in order to count as a free action. It's like think about a unicorn. Yeah, what philosophers do is they define the standards that something has to meet in order to count as a unicorn. And the scientists then go to the Tiergarten and look whether or not there is some. But it would be a bad thing if a scientist would come up, well, I found a unicorn, and it turns out that the horn is missing or something like that. And that's something philosophers try to show. So what the empirical scientists do is they look whether or not these standards are met. So whether we meet the standards for free action or consciousness. And then they try to find out whether we have the relevant abilities. Okay, so let's first talk about consciousness. Consciousness is something that has been of interest ever since human culture began. So you find interest in the most ancient cultural documents. So that's a painting from the cases in Lascaux. That's 15,000 years before Christ. Quite old. What you see here, that's a buffalo. That's a hunter. And this hunter, I mean the buffalo is dead, obviously. But the hunter is also dead. And that's obviously, I mean, interpretation is always a bit difficult, but that seems to be the hunter's soul. Yeah? Has left the hunter's body. Soul has the form of a bird, that's something that's very common. Has left the hunter's body in the moment of death. Yeah, so, and there are many, you find thoughts about consciousness and the soul in the Bible, right at the beginning of the Old Testament. Yeah. You find it in Indian writings, you find it in Homer, and you find it in So that's very interesting. Studies about non-Western cultures, I think they have made investigations on 58 cultures in all over the world, and 54 of them, so more than 90%, had ideas concerning the soul. And many of them had so the idea of the soul was very common, also in the Western cultures, so that's from Egyptian Book of the Dead. Sometimes people really thought very, very realistic. So that's the whole in the megalith tomb. And that's in order for the soul to leave the tomb and to get back. And of course, and we have this tradition still in Germany, I think in Germany, that when somebody has died, you open the window. And the idea behind it is to allow the soul to get away. So that's okay. So, and another idea of the soul is the idea of homunculus. So that's a dead warrior, and the soul is living in, and the soul has the same shape as the warrior himself. And that's because the soul represents the individual. Yeah, what's important for the individual that's represented by the soul. And that's why the soul has the same shape. Very naive, but something that's not. And you find the same in the Christian culture. So that's the moment of death, and the soul leaves, and it gets welcomed by the.
So homunculus means like a shape similar to.
Exactly. So the basic idea, I mean, that's something I would skip. So one of the ideas, how do we explain, for instance, consciousness? Well, one of the naive ideas that you find, or the ideas that I find until the 18th century, is the idea to think of consciousness as a kind of a dark room, like a camera. That's called camera obscura. Yeah? And you see on the screen of this camera, it's like a cinema. Yeah? You see all the thoughts and the feelings that you have, and all the visual observations you make, and there's somebody sitting in the room observing all this. Yeah? That's the explanation, and that's where this idea of a homunculus comes from. I mean, it explains nothing, obviously, it just moves the problem. But it's something that gives you at least a moment of relief, and that's why this idea was very popular. And the bad thing about us is that we are still working with very similar metaphors. Yeah? We don't use this explicitly, but we have very, very similar thoughts. Okay, so what is the first way of thinking about consciousness was in terms of souls. So souls were things that you could observe, that you could count. So quite popular things, quite normal things. It's very, very difficult to think about properties or about states something has. But it's very simple to think about these kind of things here. Yeah, you can count them. So people thought about, ancient cultures thought about consciousness in terms of things. Particularly, I already said, in terms either they used the metaphor of a bird or of a breeze. So most words that are known for souls, like anima, psyche, pneuma, flatus, spiritus, atma, that's an Indian word, it's always a breeze. Yeah? And the reason is obvious, because as long as you are living, and the soul also explained that you were able to live, the difference between living and not living beings, as long as you live, you are breathing, you are breathing, and you stop breathing in the moment of death. Yeah, that's the explanation. So the soul is a substance. It has typically divine creation, and it has a multitude of functions, much more than today we refer to when we talk about consciousness. So it also explains the difference between living and non-living beings. Now, the next important concept that gets introduced is the concept of mind. It's much more neutral, but it's still something like a thing, or it can at least be thought of like a thing. It replaces the word soul already in Descartes, that means in the 17th century. It's not necessarily a substance. There is a focus on cognitive ability, so while the soul also explains the ability to move, the ability to live, yeah, animate, animation, what you use in computer science, yeah, that's anima, that's the soul. That's the idea behind it. The mind is not necessarily a substance. It does not explain the difference between living and non-living beings, so it's much more focused on cognitive abilities, and it excludes particularly the vital force. Now the next step, and that's really the black and white picture, yeah, grossly simplified. Yeah? There's a whole lot of a long story to tell about the details of this development. That's a very, very simplified picture. So consciousness, one of the differences between consciousness and the soul is that consciousness is a property. And the property can be a property of the brain, it can be a property of thoughts, it can also be a property of some kind of immaterial substance. So if you think of your internal experience in terms of consciousness rather than in terms of the soul, then you don't have to subscribe to some kind of dualism, with the idea that your consciousness has been created by some kind of divine authority or something like that. Yeah? That is what you buy into if you use this word or the concept of the soul. And you also buy into dualism, that there is a difference between the brain or something physical and something non-physical. Non-physical substance. Yeah? That's what you don't have to buy into if you use the concept of consciousness. That's why this conceptual development is so important. Well, one of the bad things about consciousness is that we don't have a definition. So there is no general category, nothing that is similar or different that can be captured without reference to consciousness. If you want to explain what a cat is, well, you say, well, it's a mammal, it's a bit different from dogs, and so you have a whole lot of concepts that you can use in order to define and tell the difference. But that's not true for consciousness. So we can define consciousness. However, there's a distinctive feature of conscious states. And the feature is that you have privileged access to these states from your first person perspective. So if I have a pain feeling, I have access to this very pain feeling that nobody else has. Yeah? And that's specific for conscious pain. If I have a subconscious pain feeling, that is something that a doctor or psychiatrist or maybe even somebody else would be able to realize, maybe better than I am. Or imagine that I would be nervous. Yeah? You might realize that I'm nervous. I might not. I might deny that I'm nervous. Yeah?
You said you can't define. Well, I didn't want to say cannot, can't define.
Cannot.
Cannot.
Cannot define. Yeah? And this is not a definition. Yeah? In order to understand what it means, yeah, we already have to know what consciousness is. Yeah? So it's not a definition. It's just a feature that you know, but that if you know what consciousness is, then you would say, well, right, this is something that's really special, that's specific or distinctive for consciousness. And if you talk about first-person experience in terms of consciousness, then of course the relation to physical processes is open. It's not fixed or it's not defined by this very concept. If you
talk about it in terms of the soul, then you buy into dualism. So on the level of a dictionary, yeah, it's defined that dualism is true. But if you use consciousness, then it's open and empirical science can say.
So did you mean to suggest that, like back in the days, we thought about souls, and then we sort of started to come up with minds, and nowadays
Exactly, yeah, that's
the common
that's
current.
historical development.
All right. Okay. So nowadays we talk about consciousness, and we sort of got over the
Exactly.
past.
Yeah, that's a development that took place in the 17th. One important step has been done in the 17th century, and a particularly important part with the development of science in general, neuroscience, particularly in the 19th century, particularly after the middle of the 19th century, when brain science became very, very important.
So now there's no philosopher who talk about mind, which generally tend about.
They sometimes talk about mind, yeah, but then they use it only metaphorically. But you know, the term that is most widely used is consciousness.
Topic of consciousness.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. Now let's talk about the relationship between consciousness and the brain. If you say that consciousness is nothing that comes in addition to what goes on in the brain, then you are committed to believing something like conscious states are identical to some states or to some processes in the brain. And that is something, that seems nice at the beginning, but if you start to think about it, it becomes a bit strange. For instance, does it make sense to say the pain state is nothing else or is identical with a certain activity in your brain? Wittgenstein doubted. Identity of an object with itself is trivial, so that I'm identical with myself, that's trivially true. But identity of myself with somebody else or something else, that's obviously wrong. So, and if that is true, then the concept of identity and the idea that mental states are identical with brain states just doesn't make sense. And that's what Wittgenstein says. So roughly speaking, to say of two things that they're identical is nonsense. Obviously, that's true. I can't be identical with Angela Merkel. And to say of one thing that is identical with itself, it's to say nothing at all. To say that I'm identical with myself. So what sense does this idea make? Well, I would like to defend the idea that identity claims make sense. They make sense if you are familiar with one and the same object or process from two different perspectives. So you might reasonably think about whether or not Harry is the same person who is sitting there, it's the same person that you met, I don't know when you met the last time, 4 weeks ago, whatever. Or whether he's the twin brother of the guy who met 4 weeks ago. Yeah? So, and say this, think about Billy the Kid. Yeah? You might wonder whether he's identical with William H. Bonney Jr., who was killed by Pat Garrett in Fort something, New Mexico in, I don't know exactly when, 1920 or something like that. Or whether it's identical with Ollie L. Roberts, called Brushy Bill, who got away and then spent his life as a rodeo rider and died in, I think, the 1950s or something like that. Yeah? That seems to be an identical question. Is this guy identical? Yeah? And that doesn't mean that there are two guys and we are just putting them together. We have two descriptions. And it seems that those descriptions might be descriptions of one and the same guy. Yeah? And that doesn't make sense. And something similar goes on. Oh, there, I've confused two slides. Something similar goes on when we talk about mind and brain. So the idea is that we have two descriptions. One description from the first person perspective and one description from the third person perspective. A neuroscientific description and a first-person description, and they both refer to one and the same process. That's the idea. That's how the identity claim makes sense. And how do we confirm the identity claim? Well, if we look for strict and specific correlates, and we try to give causal explanations. If we try to make sure that all the things we can explain by referring, say, to a pain state, that they can be explained also by referring to the allegedly identical brain state. If that is true, then the best explanation for these findings, for the correlates and the causal explanation, would be to say, well, that's one and the same. And the same would go for the relationship between Billy the Kid and William H. Bonney Jr. Well, if you can make sure that all the guys who have been killed by this guy have also killed by him, then you have reason to believe that they are identical. Or think about Mark Twain and Samuel Clemens. Yeah? These are two names for one and the same person. If you find out that Samuel Clemens was always at the same place where Mark Twain was, and Samuel Clemens had an alcohol problem and became a famous writer and what have you, as Mark Twain did, then you have reasons to believe that those two guys are identical. Yeah, that's the way how you confirm things. Can always be wrong. Yeah, but sometimes it doesn't make very much sense to know that the identity claim is true. Yeah.
And Wittgenstein didn't think it was possible that.
No, he didn't. I mean, he wasn't. I mean, the identity theory came up in the real discussion about the identity theory came up quite a few years later, and he didn't follow this. Up to this time, there was only the choice between dualism and behaviorism. Yeah, and I mean, Wittgenstein didn't really subscribe to behaviorism, but he didn't want to subscribe to dualism either. So that's not really the stuff. Okay, so that's the basic idea. Yeah, mental states are brain states, and they are brain states described from a different perspective, from the perspective of neuroscience. Yeah, that's the basic idea. And it's not the brain as myself or something like that. Yeah, it's only about specific activity states, and we still have to find out what these activity states are, what the specific properties of these states are. Now, but even if you accept this or think that this might be a reasonable story, you might doubt. And I would like to share with you the doubts of, tell you something about the doubts of a famous neuroscientist, Benjamin Libet. He thinks that beliefs, desires, reasons and feelings cannot be natural properties. There can't be properties in the brain. There has to be something in addition. And that's what his reasons are. There is an unexplained, so that's a quote from his latest quote. There's an unexplained gap between the category of physical phenomena and the category of subjective phenomena. If you look into the brain with the full knowledge of its physical makeup and nerve cell activities, you would see nothing that describes subjective experience. You would only see cellular structures, interconnections, and the production of nerve impulses. So the relation between mind and brain is mysterious. Then his conclusion is, well, there has to be something in addition. Yeah, there has to be something in addition to the brain. He calls it kind of a conscious mental field. They come in addition to the brain, something like magnetic fields that you find along the brain.
What does it mean? It does not describe. I mean, as a scientist, if I describe something perfectly, I can make predictions about. If I know the present, I can predict the future.
Right.
And I would say, if I have a perfect image of the brain, I could predict everything the person might say. So what am I not explaining? What is he referring to? What is missing?
Yeah, right. So what is missing in your picture? What's missing in your picture is the subjective conscious experience. I mean, you make the predictions only on the basis of neural activities.
Yes, and I could predict everything a person might say about his consciousness.
Right. What's missing?
I think you're also missing the environment. You're also missing the environment. The environment you're missing in your case. You're missing the environment.
I don't know what you mean.
I mean, we are about to start a real discussion. Yeah? And I think I would suspect that most of your concerns will be addressed a few slides later. So I think you are almost right. Just want to. I mean, that's an intuition that many of us have every now and then. Yeah, and I would like to address and show why this intuition is false. So I think what Libet by and large does is like somebody who opens the hard disk of his computer and wonders where all the pictures are, the text are, and the music is. It's just only the hard disk. Yeah, and there's code on the hard disk, but there are no pictures. In particular, the difference, the basic phenomenal experiential difference between pictures and music. Yeah? It's so different. You won't find it there. So what's the error underlying this? Well, the error is that obviously, so yeah, there's no stored text or pictures or sound there. So, and then you would have to conclude with Libet's argument that stored text, pictures, sounds are no natural entities. Yeah, and that's obviously wrong. So, and why it is wrong? Well, it is wrong because there are two levels of this, at least two levels. There are more, actually there are more levels, but the most interesting ones are first one that could be called the output level, or you could also say the program level, or whatever. And then we would talk about text, pictures, and sounds. Yeah? So, of course, there are text, pictures, and sounds. We can do that. But of course, what we do need, we have to, and then there's another level, the hardware level, where we have patterns of magnetic activity. And how do those fit together? Well, if we want to understand how they fit together, what we need is, particularly we have to know the code in which the pictures and the text and the music are encoded on the hard disk. And of course, the specific, we need a precise description of the hard disk, so that really gives us the patterns of magnetic activity. And then we have to decode the electrical or the program code, and then we can understand why what's on the hard disk in some sense, sometimes is a text, in other cases it might be a piece of music or a picture. And the same goes for the brain. Yeah, you cannot just look on the brain and look for where the pictures are or the feelings are. You have to decode the code, and this code is a neural code. Yeah? That's the basic idea. And that's the error. And this error comes in all varieties. Yeah, that people say, well, you cannot understand. Yeah, but if you look at the brain with your eyes, you can be expected to decode the code, the neural code. That's obviously the case. Okay, but still, there might still, so we have two levels of description. The first person perspective, where we talk about beliefs, desires, reasons, and feelings, and the third person perspective, where we talk about neural activities, two descriptions of one process. And however, I think we need something in addition. So we have to understand the neural code, we need a precise description of correlating mental states and brain states, but what we also need is some kind of connection between the first and the third person perspective. What does it mean that we need a connection between the first and the third person perspective? But I said before that in order to make sure that the reference or the things we describe from two perspectives, that they are identical, we have to make sure that they have the same causal consequences. Yeah? That if we want to be sure that Mark Twain is identical with Samuel Clemens, it's not enough that Samuel Clemens was always at the same place where Mark Twain was. Maybe they were twin brothers, or they were just friends, and always were at the same place. Yeah? We also have to make sure that the causal consequences are the same, so that everything we can explain by referring to Mark Twain can be explained by referring to Samuel Clemens. Otherwise, there will be always doubts whether they were really identical. So far, so clear. Please ask me if something that I say seems mysterious to you or just unclear. Okay?
I don't know where you're getting at, but I think in your example with Mark Twain, what was the other guy?
Yeah, Samuel, it's not the other guy.
I know,
one name. Mark Twain is only an artist.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So the
Samuel
interesting
Clemens
thing
is
to be considering is probably that, what was the other?
Samuel Clemens.
Samuel Clemens' name gives rise to our notion of Mark Twain, rather than, but that's probably a discussion for later.
Yeah, let's talk about it later. I don't think
one
that
could
can...
be the causal reason for the other, they're not necessarily identical. Just like a magnetic thing is not identical to the picture.
Exactly.
It's not actually identical.
Yeah, right. Yeah. That's, yeah. This comparison, I guess, it can be understood in two different ways, and if you understand it in one way, then there's no identical. A magnet is not identical with magnetic fields, obviously. Yeah, right. We'll talk about it. Okay, okay, so what is important is that there is no causal relation between things that are supposed to be identical. Yeah? Angela Merkel is identical with the present chairman of the Christian Democratic Party. There's no causal relation between the... Yeah? If there were, then of course there would be an identity relation. Yeah? Is this clear? Yeah? So the conclusion would be, in order to make sure that there is an identity relation, you have to make sure that there is no causal relation between them, rather that those two things have exactly the same causes and effects. So in order to make sure, and that brings me back to how to remove any mystery from the mind and brain relation, you have to make sure that the causes and effects of the mental states are exactly the same as the causes and effects of the brain states you think are identical with the mental states. So if you think that pain experience is identical with activity in a certain area of the brain, you should be able to explain everything that you think is caused by a pain state, when some kind of bodily reaction, your desire to take a pain relief drug, your desire to go to a doctor, or whatever, by the activity of this area in the brain. That's the basic idea. Yeah.
So then let me ask you, where's this notion coming from that we need to explain them such that they are identical? What's wrong with saying that one is causing the other? Why do we currently think this is the way it should be?
No, it may well be that brain states cause mental states and the mental states cause brain states, but then you are into dualism.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not bad to be a dualist. Yeah, it's not morally bad, but it raises some problems. For instance, if we think that the soul is something that comes in addition to the mental is something that comes in addition to the brain, then of course you have to look for causal interactions between the mental and what goes on in the brain. Most typically, people who think that the mental is something that comes in addition to the brain thinks the mental is nothing physical. Then you would have causal relation between physical and non-physical things. That goes against one of the basic principles of natural science, namely the principle of causal closure. Yeah? That's something, it may be wrong. Yeah? That's only a heuristic principle. But normally we would hesitate to give up those principles, particularly if we have another theory that wouldn't commit us to giving up this principle.
So what if there was a third way?
Yeah, let's talk about it then. Yeah, so let's keep in mind that if you think that if there is a causal relation between mental states and physical states, then you buy into interactionist dualism. And interactionist dualism has a lot of, there's no empirical evidence whatsoever for interactionist dualism. Yeah, and I come back to Libet, whom I was talking about. Yeah, he did perform experiments that were intended to show that there is such an interaction, and that it didn't work out. Yeah, but that doesn't prove that it's false. But again, there is no evidence for this. Okay, so in order to make sure, in order to make sure that mental states are physical states, we have to show that they have the same causes and the same effect. And if we fail, then of course that would be an argument in favor of dualism. So it's that's the important part. That's an empirical question. So much about consciousness. Now, if you have,
so this is the cutting edge, right? This is basically our current understanding.
Right. I could add. That's a very, very coarse-grained picture of our consciousness. Yeah. So I could add 10 hours or something like that. Yeah, in more details. But I think that would be, in most cases, more confusing. So if you have questions, if you have very urgent questions, maybe should we discuss them now?
No.
Okay.
Maybe another talk some other day.
Okay, you're right. So then let's. The second part is about free will. So I would like to again start with kind of an intuition, the idea that what freedom requires is an absence of determinism. So you are only free if what you do is not determined, particularly not determined by the laws of nature. One scientist who was a German psychologist who did a lot of very important stuff on decision-making processes, follow-up experiments on this famous experiments by Benjamin Libet. He says the idea of human free will is incompatible in principle with scientific considerations. Scientific research is based on the assumption that everything that happens has a cause, and that it's possible to find this cause. And I think he's perfectly right. I cannot understand why an empirical scientist can believe that free and therefore undetermined action is conceivable. So if you buy into free will, then you have to give up science, or at least basic scientific principle. If you are a scientist, then you can believe that there is freedom. However, all this is based on an assumption. Namely on the assumption, and that comes here just in a kind of parenthesis, that freedom implies an absence of determinism. Yeah? And that's what in philosophical terms is called an incompatibilist position. The idea that freedom and determinism are incompatible. Whereas compatibilists think that there may be freedom even if there is determinism. And I would like to show you that compatibilism is not a completely inside idea. Okay, how would that go? Well, I think we have to come back to what we typically think, or what we typically require when we think an action is free and responsible. Well, I think if we do so, then we make two distinctions. We would distinct a free and responsible action from action that has been performed under compulsion. So we would never say that an action that has been performed under compulsion is free. So what we need is some kind of autonomy. Yeah? And autonomy understood just as the absence of force or compulsion, that's all. Now, second, we make a second distinction. We would also not say that an action is free if it's just a random event. So, no, and what's the difference between a random event and a free action? Well, it's that a free action can be ascribed to an agent. Yeah, a free agent is in some sense responsible for an action, and only if there is this connection, even if the agent really was the author, has caused or has the action under control, then you can hold them responsible. Yeah? That's why you have to make this distinction. And this distinction, that's not, both these distinctions are accepted by almost everybody. Yeah? No, so and that's necessary obviously for responsibility, so you can't hold native responsible for the violation of a norm if the relevant action was not under the agent's control. That's why you need this connection between agents and that's so far. Yeah.
Can you explain what compulsion in this context really is? Is it force from outside, or can it be inside compulsion?
Maybe. Maybe
it's also something we cannot perceive yet, and then
maybe, yeah.
But then would not be free, but we would perceive it to be
That-
autonomous.
That maybe I might have. There was a campaign for cigarettes back in those years where campaigns for cigarettes were still allowed, and the basic slogan was ich liebe es zu rauchen, I love smoking, something like that. Yeah, and so it suggested. This seems to suggest that this was kind of a free decision. Let's assume that this was. Yeah, and it may well be that they said this, or that they had this feeling under the compulsion of addiction to nicotine. Yeah. So of course that's possible. You think you are free. You think you have make self-determined, and it's not true. Yeah, that's of course. Yeah, right. So one of the ideas of a philosophical clarification of freedom is to find some kind of objective standards that go beyond your own feeling of being free or being responsible. Or something. Yeah, that's true. And therefore, it can well be that you think you are free and actually are not.
So what would this criteria be? Yeah, compulsion from the outside, I guess, counts as compulsion, but compulsion from the inside
would also count.
count.
Yeah, it might be kind of a psychological addiction.
But where is then the line? Inside? Like you can't
Inside, outside doesn't play any role.
Is anything we can demonstrate as being compulsive?
Right,
Is
yeah.
or not free?
I have a more fine-grained criteria for this. Yeah, I don't want to go too much into the details, but I would be happy to do so after the talk. Okay. Yeah. So the idea is that something is not, you don't act under compulsion if it depends on your own beliefs and desires, and your own beliefs and desires are those which you can change if you want to. Okay.
So the belief is that between compulsion and chance there is somewhere.
Exactly.
Ideally, it's not zero, but it's
Exactly. Yeah, that's the idea. So what does it mean? So in positive terms, well, it means that or you can translate these two, or you can do justice to those two criteria if you say, well, what is required is self-determination. You have to determine, or you have to make your own decisions based on your own beliefs and desires. Then you do justice to the absence of compulsion. So if you act according to your own beliefs and desires, then of course you don't act under compulsion, under external determination. So the principle of autonomy is met. Yeah? So the idea would be that if you have an obsessive compulsive disorder, this is something that it's the decisions that you make then are not your own decision. It's not your own beliefs and desires. It's something that comes from outside, not the body taking it as an outside, but yourself making the decision. And I can say a bit more about this distinction between yourself and outside, which is again not the body. And of course, self-determined action means that the action is determined by the agent themselves. That would mean that the principle of authorship is met. There is the connection that is required in order to make the difference between freedom and chance. Yeah? I act out of my own beliefs and my own desires. So think about an agent who thinks that, or who believes and really has a strong belief that stealing is reprehensible. If it's really true that the agent believes makes it intelligible or explains that the agent paid rather than steal the goods in his basket, then we would have reasons to believe that the agent acted in that this was a self-determined action. That's at least the idea now. And you will have, I think, a host of objections, and we should discuss them later. Let me, maybe the most, so my claim would be that self-determination is an adequate analysis of these two basic requirements, authorship and autonomy. There may be additional criteria necessary. But most likely you think that, no, wait. So an action would be, according to this criterion, an action would be self-determined and therefore free if it's determined by features that constitute the most likely beliefs and desires that are constitutive for the agent themselves. So if those beliefs and desires, I call them personal preference, but nothing hinges on it, if they explain that the agent did X and not Y. So if my belief that there was a storm coming up tonight it was really my own belief, was the reason why I took a cab rather than taking the bicycle or just walking to the Petersburg Castle. Now, if those beliefs and desires are physically realized, then of course that is nothing that interferes with your ability to act in a self-determined fashion. So it just helps you or enables you to do so. Yeah? It's like a computer. If something would be, if PowerPoint wouldn't be realized in some sense in the CPU of this computer, then the computer wouldn't be able to present a PowerPoint presentation. The same is with your belief that stealing is reprehensible. Yeah? It needs some representation in your brain. So the representation in your brain enables you to act in a responsible and self-determined manner. It's not, these are these crazy metaphors. Yeah? It wasn't me, it was my brain. Or my neurons made me do something. They enabled you to do something. Yeah? There is no interference between brain processes and yourself, at least if your mental processes are physically real. Yeah.
Sorry, quick question. The previous section, when we talk about people's beliefs,
right.
Are we talking about observed as in you hand someone a question and you say, I noticed that you've stolen some money, how do you think about stealing? Against, for? In what sense, how do you know that someone believes something? I mean, you're obviously not looking at their behaviour, because you're saying that beliefs can obviously differ from behaviour. So
right, yeah. Well, I mean, I think at this point, I'm not so much talking about how do we make sure in an actual case that somebody was acting freely. I'm only talking about the criteria that have to be met. Yeah? But I do think that it's possible to find out what somebody believes. I mean, of course, when the person, in the actual case, the person will tell that they believe those things that would allow them to get away with what they've done. That's true. But I think there are ways to find out what a person believes and what are strong beliefs of a person, at least in normal cases. So I don't think that this is a very, very, what should I say, an unsurmountable difficulty of this account. Yeah? So there are ways to find out what people believe, nobody would say. But let's talk about this. That's also the beginning of the discussion, I think. Okay? But I would be happy to come back to this. Yeah? So the idea is, let's assume we know what people believe and what their desires are. Yeah? Then, and if those beliefs and desires meet some additional criteria that allow us to say these are their own beliefs and desires, then if they act according to those beliefs and desires, then they are free. And I would like, yeah, very short question.
Just, okay, it's not related.
Yeah.
Okay. So you're saying this, you're giving this example of the neurons enabling the physical realization, enabling the self-determination. Wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Isn't that a dualist statement? Otherwise, you would have to say the neurons were.
Were the set beliefs or preferences would enable a certain decision to happen.
The neurons, the idea is, come back to this, let's come back to this example of my belief that comprehension. And the question then is, and I said, well, if this is really my own belief, then if I acted according to this belief, and I really acted out of this belief, then I acted in a self-determined fashion and therefore free. Now, then the objection, well, this belief is realized by neural activities, it's not myself, it's the neurons in my brain. I said, well, that's if you really think that your beliefs are realized by neural activity. Yeah? So if you buy into physicalism, if you are dualist, then of course this objection might be true. But if you buy into physicalism, then those neurons realize, and the neurons realize this belief, then they enable you to act according to this belief. Yeah.
You wouldn't say that they did it.
No, they...
Because if they didn't do it, then they are separate from the thing that did it.
The neurons are entirely independent of this. The neurons might enable you to do it. One set of neurons enable you, another set of neurons make you do it.
Of course, they
might different level of analysis. What I understood you to be saying is that if you want to make free will and determinism compatible, which seems to be what you're trying to get at, there's a set of experiences or preferences or beliefs which might enable you to act in a certain way but don't necessarily compel you to do it.
Exactly.
And whether that happens on a neural level or at a
That's
soul
right,
level
yeah.
is not part of
Exactly.
what you're saying.
But then we basically have a disconnect between brain state and mind.
So the assumption is that these two topics are going to be brought together at the moment.
Oh, okay.
That the neural basis for this, the questions about neural interaction with your decisions will become apparent, but the first thing is to frame the distinction between free will and determinism.
Let's come back to this.
Yeah.
It's only a possible objection. And, okay. So the idea that something is self-determined is cashed out by the idea that it's determined by the agent preference, by the agent beliefs and desires, and that requires a robust connection between the preferences, those beliefs and desires, and the action. And if that is true, and that seems to be necessary in order to make the distinction between freedom and chance events, then of course a moment of indetermination would interfere with your ability to act according to your beliefs and desires. So imagine that you really don't want to steal, then of course if you would live in an indeterminate world, it could happen that you find yourself stealing something, even if you don't want it. And that seems to interfere. And we'll come back to some more examples for this. So if that is true so far, then what is decisive is not whether an action is determined, such that an action is only free if it's not determined, if it's not free if it's determined, but the important question is how it is determined. If it's determined by yourself, by your own beliefs and your own desires, then it's free, and that's all you can. But still you might have the idea, well, if it's determined, for instance, imagine if we live in a deterministic world, then everything I do was determined from the Big Bang on. So from the Big Bang on, it was determined that he would come to this lecture tonight and wouldn't stay at home and watch the TV because the weather is so bad. Now, that's again a very, very powerful intuition. And many philosophers think that that's one of the reasons why we should think that determinism is incompatible with freedom. I don't think there are a number of technical issues that I want to mention today. I think there's also a very intuitive counter-argument. So imagine if it's really true that actions, that determining factors before your birth interfere with your ability to act freely, then it should be sufficient to just cut this causal chain, this deterministic causal chain, right before your birth. Yeah? And then you should have an additional album, something like that. Yeah? So far, this is the consideration. Yeah, additional freedom.
Not
Okay.
a third.
Huh?
Not a third. Not a third.
No, elbow room.
Metaphorical.
I thought this was like some exciting new German idiom. I don't remember this.
No, it's not. There's a book on elbow room by then. Book about free. Okay, but that wouldn't make a difference. So if there would really cut off the causal chain right before your birth, you couldn't make your birth, because before your birth you wouldn't be living. There would be no way to take advantage of this cut of the causal chain. Yeah? It just doesn't make sense. And it doesn't depend on what happened before my birth.
Why wouldn't I living? Didn't we, in the historical, separate being alive from mind and consciousness?
Yeah, it depends. If we say before your birth, and if you would make a difference between... No, that's the question again.
You said when we separate that point that you would not be living before. I don't know.
Separate which one?
No, if you could somehow magically cut
The causal chain, that's the
this
idea.
causal chain before you
Yeah.
are born, then it must have some influence on your life. But since it wouldn't exist, it doesn't make sense to say it has an influence on your life.
It's a bit problematic here.
I
because-
Let's. I mean, I think it would be better to postpone the discussion. Otherwise, I mean, if there's too much interruption, it makes it more difficult to follow. Yeah. So the basic idea is, the assumption is the compatibility or the claim that freedom and determinism are compatible is unintuitive, because then you would have to accept that you are free even if what you do today has been determined by the Big Bang. And that sounds intuitive. Yeah? If what you do is determined by events before your birth, you have no control on events before your birth. How could you be free? Yeah? That seems to be a very powerful intuition. Now, if you buy this intuition, if the fact that something happens before your birth really interferes with your freedom, then just cutting or preventing this event from having an impact on your life should give you more freedom. And I tried to show that this is not the case. Now, if you cut the causal chain before your birth, it won't give you any more freedom.
What's with alcohol fetal syndrome?
Sorry, what?
Alcohol fetal syndrome.
Yeah, wait.
Because
So you
the
said
is good.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that doesn't happen before your birth. Yeah, it's something.
yeah.
It's an impact.
It happens before my birth. So if my mother's pregnant, she drinks too much, then this is an effect.
Yeah,
And it has also an effect on my consciousness later.
Yeah, okay. So, yeah, I was not really precise. Yeah, we should have said conception. But of course, I don't deny that that of course there are factors that happen before your birth that might have a negative impact on what happens afterwards. But the reason is not that they happen before your birth. It's just that they interfere with your ability to act in a self-determined way. Yeah. So, of course, it may happen that your mother was addicted. That prevents your brain from developing. Yeah. But this interference can be accounted for by the theory I gave you before. So it's not the fact that it didn't happen before your birth. Yeah? So the problem we are talking about is, do have events or facts that happen before your birth a special impact on your freedom? And I'm arguing that this is not so. If the brain damage that was caused by your mother's addiction would have been caused after your birth, it would make no difference. And this damage, this interference for your freedom can be accounted for by this idea of self-determination that I gave you before, because this brain damage will prevent you from acting in a self-determined manner. So it's not the event before your birth, it's the damage to your brain after your birth, that counts. That's the important point. Okay.
But the event happened before, and the damage was also before. So
No, the damage becomes relevant.
okay,
That's
yeah,
important.
Okay,
Damage becomes relevant after your birth.
yeah.
Yeah, and it can be counted for by the criteria I gave you. So the important question is, do events that happen before my birth have a specific influence or interference with my freedom just before they happen before my birth? And I say, no, this is not the case. It's not, of course, there are all kinds of events that may have an impact on my ability to act freely, but only if they have an effect after my birth.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
that's
you just say they are relevant only after the birth.
exactly. Yeah, that's important. No matter when these events happen. Yeah.
You don't
And
need
they are-
determinism to explain the brain. I think.
Yeah, that's another question. Yeah, of course, it could also be that
That's
they
not
have
yours,
indeterminate effects.
That's it.
Okay, let's come back to this. Yeah, that's again a question of discussion. So the idea is, okay, so the idea is it doesn't make a difference when those events happen. Yeah. Okay, so now let's think about the decision. Maybe we need indeterminism, or the idea or the intuition that freedom and determinism are incompatible is because we need indetermination in the decision-making process. There needs to be just one point where both options are open. Think about your decision to attend this lecture today. Yeah? If it has been a free decision, then there should be one point in your decision-making process where it was really open, whether you would decide to go to come here, or you could decide to stay at home. Yeah? And that seems to be very reasonable. Now, I would like to show you that this is not reasonable. Yeah, this is the. Think about, in order to see this, think about somebody, and I now simplify the picture, but it's only a simplification to demonstrate the basic idea. The simplification doesn't have any impact on the basic question, so it's only a simplification for being able to present it in a more obvious way. So think about somebody who makes a decision, tries to make a decision whether or not they want to do a study of philosophy, rather than doing a study of agriculture. Say. And the person really has very, very strong beliefs and desires to do agriculture. Yeah, they always read books about agriculture. Their father was a farmer, and grandfather was also whatever. But they also have some tendency, but they have much stronger beliefs and desires towards agriculture. Now, they make a decision-making process of 1 week, and in the first half week, they think about all the beliefs and all the factors that are relevant for agriculture. So all the beliefs and desires that are relevant and favor agriculture are thought about in the first half of this decision-making process. In the second half of the week, they only think about and then there is a cut in the middle, this moment of indetermination that is thought to enhance the ability to make a free and a self-determined decision. And afterwards, they think about the reasons in favor of studying philosophy. So far, so clear? Now, what would the decision be? They would study philosophy. Because all the reasons that would speak in favor of agriculture wouldn't have an effect, couldn't have an effect, due to this moment of indetermination in the middle of the decision-making process, wouldn't be able to have an effect on the decision.
I don't see how that follows. I mean, he could still remember what he decided, how good agriculture was.
Yeah, but
then it's not lost.
It's the way you define the cut that makes it impossible.
Yeah, but I mean, if we think about a decision-making process, so the idea is that you assess certain arguments or you assess certain factors, and depending on how important you think these factors are, you make the decision.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah? So let's assume that the assessment of the factors in favor of agriculture are done at the beginning of the decision-making process, in the first half of the work. So let's assume there is some kinds of, you add up all the factors in favor of agriculture at the beginning of the process, and then you add up all the factors in favor of philosophy the end of the decision-making process. But in the middle is just this cut, so that nothing that happened before has any effect on what happens afterwards. That's how this cut is defined.
Where is the cut coming from?
Huh?
The cut doesn't make sense. Basically saying what I did last week doesn't have any influence on what I'm doing now.
Yeah, but that's what indetermination means. Yeah? If there's a moment of indetermination, then it's just random what happens afterwards. That's the basic, very idea of indetermination. Yeah? So what I would like to show is that if you want to have indetermination in a decision-making process, that just makes a reasonable decision-making process, a rational decision-making process, that accounts for all the relevant factors impossible, or at least interferes with this possibility. Yeah? So if you, and that means it interferes with your possibility to act according to your own beliefs and desires. Yeah? It's not always that serious as it was in my picture, because the picture was roughly simplified, but the basic will never give you any additional possibility to act according to your own beliefs and desires. Okay, we can go. So, my conclusion is that indetermination does not enhance freedom. I don't say that freedom is impossible in an indeterminate world. If there's, so I don't think that determination is necessary. A slight amount of indetermination, I think, is not. It doesn't interfere so much with freedom, but it doesn't enhance freedom. That's the important point. So again, what is decisive is not whether, but how an action is determined, and neurally realized act of will may be self-determined. That was the point with the neural realization of my belief that seems reprehensible.
Just a definition question: is a difference between indetermination and randomness, kind of? If something is not determined?
Yeah, in a not black and white, yeah, of course it is. Yeah. So there may be indetermination, even if, I mean, randomness is, normally we would think that there's a 50% probability that one of two alternatives will happen.
I mean, it doesn't have to, could be any language, but yeah.
And indetermination means that there might be 1% chance that something else happens. And yes, there's a difference. But I think the same holds for lower levels of indetermination as well. Even if I think that lower levels of indetermination don't interfere with your ability to act in a self-determined way in any relevant fashion. Yeah? So there you may say that you acted in a self-determined way with the probability that you would do something else, or just 1 or 2 or 3%. But that's difficult to argue where you have to make the cut between.
And if you cultivate a desire to act indeterminately?
If you
specifically cultivate a desire to act indeterminately?
You cultivate the desire to act indeterminately. That may... that's a difficult
not connected with, so you've created a kind of dichotomy between acts and beliefs. And beliefs are things that cause acts, and there's a moment of determinism, which is, that suggests that one has chosen beliefs.
Yeah.
And therefore, if you, so you're using the sense of belief in two different senses. So on the one hand, you're saying that the beliefs will automatically lead to certain acts, and that's the sense in which it's determined. But at the same time, you want to say that in order for this moment of indetermination to make you unfree, that you have in some sense chosen these beliefs. That the moment of freedom, the reason you should be frustrated with indetermination as a free actor, is that you've chosen all these beliefs for yourself, and damn it, there's a moment of indetermination which has meant that you've done something different from what you set up. So you're using, on the one hand, freedom to choose acts, but the paradox is that you're also using freedom to choose your beliefs in the first place.
That would be bad, if I would say something like this. But I'm not saying this. So, but again, should we discuss this later? So that's an important question. I would be happy to answer the question right now, but it's so what is the condition?
Before I forget.
Yeah, right. So let's say but that's an important question. So I mean, the question is, what is the requirement for a belief to count as my own belief? Would the requirement be that I made an indeterminate choice for this very belief? That's what you seem to suggest, and that would be detrimental for the theory.
But that's why it's frustrating. If you say that it's not an enhancement of freedom, that depends on the idea that your beliefs are freely chosen. Because you've set things up, you've chosen your set of beliefs, and then the reason that this freedom is not an enhancement of your freedom is that the indeterminism is fighting against the beliefs that you've chosen.
You make an assumption that I don't. Okay, then let's discuss it now. I mean, that's also that last slide. So no, I don't think so. So I said.
Can you just summarize that again?
Yeah.
I didn't fully follow.
So the idea is, or the objection is, that I have an inconsistent idea of beliefs. On the one hand, I say, well, my actions have to be determined by my beliefs in order for the action to count as self-determined. Yeah, that's what I said. That's perfectly true. But why would I say that those beliefs are my beliefs? And the answer is, oh, that's what Harry wants to suggest. The answer is, well, because I have freely chosen those beliefs.
And you didn't say that.
And in an indeterminate way. Yeah, that seems to be. So now, my response. Why would that be? My account of freedom is not an indeterminate account of freedom. So in order for a decision to accept or endorse a certain belief or a desire, to count for this decision, to count as free, indetermination is not necessary. Yeah? Because it's quite the contrary. If the action or the decision-making process, for instance, I make the decision to acquire the belief that no, I would.
There's something else.
That
To believe in God?
no. Something more. There's a committee of the Catholic Church that makes a scientific decision on miracles.
But why don't you use your example with agricultural philosophy? So you've made you have a belief that agriculture is of more service to humankind.
Okay, yeah, okay. So let's assume I make a decision to endorse this belief that agriculture does a service to human nature. For this decision to count as a free decision, it has to be built on all the other beliefs I have. If it were just in order to count as a free decision according to my own standards, I think even independent of my own standards. So there is an idea in philosophy of ultimate responsibility. Yeah. So and that's an idea you find in Kant, for instance. And the idea is you are ultimately responsible only if you start a causal chain. Yeah? So if you don't start a causal chain, then you always depend on something that happened before, and then you can't be free. So you have to start a causal chain out of nothing. And that's a very problematic idea for various reasons. One reason is that if you really start this causal chain out of nothing, then it's independent of all the other things you are convinced of. All the other things that you think are important for your life. All the experience you made before. Yeah? So it cannot be distinguished, in other words, from a chance event. And I try to show that chance event interfere with our ability to act freely. The other reason is it possible to start a causal chain? That's an incoherent idea. Because either, let's assume that the beginning of the causal chain is when this presenter falls down here. Now, either I start this causal chain, then I start this act of the presenter falling down, but well, then this is not the start of the causal chain, because it has been initiated by my finger. Or it is the start of the causal chain, then I cannot have initiated that. So it's also an incoherent idea. So, and now that's only why I think that's not a good idea. How to distinguish my beliefs from those beliefs that are not my beliefs. I don't think that all the beliefs in my body or my brain are my beliefs. Yeah? Some of those beliefs might have been implemented by my parents, for instance.
But when people generally talk, when they feel like there's no compulsion from the outside and they act through their beliefs, they feel free, or even if the belief might come from the outside.
Exactly.
So that's compatible with this.
Now, no, that's not compatible with my theory. That would also be bad. Just if I wouldn't, I mean, this was the question you asked, yeah? What's the decisive criteria? Is it my feeling of freedom? That would be a very bad idea. So I haven't given you the positive criterion so far. The positive criterion for belief or a desire or another preference to count as my own preference is I have to be in control of this preference. And being in control of this preference means that if I make the decision, if I would make the decision to give up this preference, the belief or desire, then I would be able to do so. Yeah? Now think about my belief that stealing is reprehensible. Yeah? In order for this belief to count as my own belief, I should be able to give it up if I make the decision to give it up. Now when I was studying, there were very, very good reasons why stealing is not reprehensible. If you would, you could fight against capitalism by stealing, and you could get all the foods for a Wohngemeinschaft. What's Wohngemeinschaft in apartment share?
Flat share.
Huh?
Flat share.
Flat share. Flat share community or something like that. Yeah, something like that. Yeah, that was very popular. So you could get all the food for free for your flat share community if you would steal. So there were very good reasons. So now, in order for my belief that stealing is reprehensible to count as my belief according to the standard that I gave you, it would have been, let's assume all the other guys in my flat share community convinced me that stealing is a very good thing. And I made the decision to give it up. If I would be able to give it up, then this belief would count as my own belief. It's not that I actually have to give it up, yeah? That there is just a chance that I give it up.
But then okay, so you've made this decision to give up the belief that
exactly.
That thing.
And I should
And then you have a moment where there's an indeterminist moment where you then choose to steal. And your argument is that it's indetermination, which actually means that an indeterminate world is not enhancement of freedom. You will be freer if you are always fulfilling the momentum of your beliefs. But that's only dependent on being able to choose those beliefs in the first place. So in order for indeterminism to be not enhancement to your freedom, you're assuming that you did have some previous state of freedom where the beliefs were chosen.
No, I'm not assuming. No, I'm not assuming. No, I'm not assuming that I choose my beliefs.
Then you would simply be your beliefs, just as your acts, would just be causally determined in a very rigid way.
Yeah. I'm assuming that this is possible. I'm trying to argue that determination doesn't interfere. The mere fact that it's determined isn't the important question. The question is determined by whom or by what. If it's externally determined, if it's outside my control, then it interferes with my freedom. Let's come back to if it's so abstract, then it's maybe confusing. Let's come back to this example of my belief that stealing is reprehensible. So my criterion is that if I make the decision, and this decision doesn't need to be indeterminate, it should depend on all the other things that I believe, otherwise it wouldn't be my decision. If I make the decision to give up the belief that stealing is reprehensible, I should be able to realize this, to put this decision into effect, to give up the belief. That's the criterion. If this is so, then this is really my belief. Then I'm in control of this belief. The alternative criterion, that I make a decision out of nothing, a completely indeterminate decision, makes it dependent or just undermines my control, because then it just depends on a random event whether or not I give up the belief. Then I'm not in control.
In your example, the break,
yeah, right.
the cut, if you like, is between the belief and the action. So there's a moment of indeterminism. So you could say stealing is wrong, and then suddenly find yourself stealing something. Right. And in a sense, that's why this indeterminate moment, in how you presented it, is not an enhancement of your freedom, because actually you spent this time deciding that stealing is wrong, and all of a sudden you've stolen something. And that was only possible because there was an indeterminate moment. But what I'm saying is that the indeterminate moment, in a sense, it's circular, because the beliefs were chosen, presumably by previous indeterminate moments.
No, I try to explain why this is not a good idea. Yeah. So the the account is completely consistent with respect first to the moment of decision making, whether or not I'm stealing, and to the moment of deciding whether or not I should acquire a belief. Basically, I don't think that we normally make decisions whether or not we acquire beliefs. We acquire beliefs for some reason or other, or find ourselves with having certain beliefs, and then may reflect about those beliefs. And then the important question is whether or not we are able to give up or to control those beliefs. That's, from my point of view, whether if we are able to assess those beliefs, evaluate those beliefs, on the basis of all the other things we believe and think is true, then that's all we can ask. This is all we can ask for.
Yeah. Example I found really helpful was this belief things. Basically, when you say you change your belief, or you want to really freely in this indeterminate sense that you can decide to act against your belief. But then it's just a regress, and the question is, on what basis
Exactly,
do you decide to act against your belief?
Yeah.
So you go one level deeper, and what is that based on? And
Right.
If you follow through, it's just an infinite regress. Where's the decision coming from? But if it's not you, then it's, as you said, in the German.
Yeah. So you need, that's true, yeah. Wherever you put in indeterminism, you always have a loss of control. I think you all had,
I don't understand how the question about determinism and free will goes together with beliefs, because beliefs is what, in my opinion, defines a determination which makes you unfree in your choices. Because I don't know if you have read Dostoevsky's Schuld und Sühne. I mean, the whole book is about somebody who does choices out of his beliefs, and he rechtfertigt sie. He justifies, he justifies them with his beliefs. But I think in the moment we have to distinguish between freedom of will and freedom of action and freedom of. We have to distinguish between a lot of different ways of determination and of choice and for example, the first part of this talk, was about brain and mind and consciousness, and I'm trying to put this two parts together.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about two examples. An alcoholic person who says, I'm not an alcoholic person, and the magicians say, yeah, but you are alcoholic, you drink every day, and blah, 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 blah. And then there's a woman in Iran, and she's wearing a burqa, and she's, I don't know, having a really shitty life, and she says, yeah, but I feel free, I'm a free person. And then I'm asking myself, how can we put this things together in this example?
I think you're completely right. It may well be.
We believe worth in this case, and what
so I think you're completely right. These are certainly examples where either I'm wrong in my judgment or my assessment of these people are wrong in their own assuming. Describe these situations. These people are really wrong in their assessment as to whether they are free or not free. They are obviously not free, but they still think they are. And that's why I said, I mean, this was a similar question like the one you asked before. I may be just wrong with my own feeling or my own judgment whether or not I'm free. That's why someone's own judgment doesn't play any role in this account. What plays an account is only the relation between the person's own beliefs and desires and what the person does. Now, what about situations then where isn't it possible, and that was the first question, isn't it possible that my beliefs interfere with my freedom? Yes, of course that's possible. Yeah? I may have beliefs that interfere with my ability to act freely. Imagine that I was raised in a community of, I don't know, in a very, very strong fundamentalist religious community, yeah? Where I was taught not to steal, say, or not to have sex, or whatever. And that this may have an impact which would prevent me from making my own decisions. Yeah, when we would intuitively say, I don't pay for the goods in my basket just because it's my belief, because I do so because I was trained, because my parents told me so. And this criterion that I told you, so the criterion that you need to have the control over your belief is intended to do justice exactly to those facts. Namely, if my parents just trained me or implanted the belief that stealing is reprehensible into my brain, or that it's necessary to wear a burqa or whatever, yeah, then I wouldn't be able to realize my decision to get rid of this belief. Yeah? Then this belief wouldn't be under my control, and therefore it wouldn't fail to meet the criterion I came up with. So I think the criterion can account for the objection that you gave.
I misunderstood.
Sorry,
Yeah.
again?
Of the discussion, you talk about causality, that's okay, that's I get it, the determinism, but it's not implicit on causality, so empirical system or method is not incompatible with freedom. I mean, we are talking about, okay, believe, how we choose, how we make choices, something that,
Yeah.
if we take in account that empirism, like scientific method, can just get to verify something, and the method is allowed. A point A is have a cause, that's maybe it's B.
Yeah.
This chain doesn't disappear. I mean,
No, why should it disappear?
yeah, but how you can assume we are free, or how we can make a determination that free will exists if we assume that our method is an empirical method?
I tried to show why this is possible. So imagine that at point R,
And this is what I miss. That's what
yeah, at point R, I make the decision out of my own beliefs and desires to attend to, or to give this lecture.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
So when Harry wrote me the email, I don't know, 2 weeks ago or something like that, I thought about it for a while and I said, yes, of course, that would be a nice idea, and I give this lecture.
Yeah.
So these were my own beliefs and my own desires.
How
To
do you
give
know
this
that?
lecture. Huh?
How do you know
Yeah,
that?
Because these,
It's the same with the book, she.
Yeah,
Yeah,
is it like
so-
a cultural question if it's free or not? The woman believes that it is free, it's her own decision, but we can show you she just decide her belief is just that way because she grew up in that culture. And for me, it's a contradiction if the definition of being free that depends on the culture.
no, it doesn't depend on the culture. It depends in the case of the woman and also in my own case on the question whether or not the beliefs and the desires that lead to your decision are under your control. And being under your control means you can get rid of those beliefs and desires if you decide to do
And
so.
how do you decide? So
When?
you ask her,
No.
can she?
When?
can
No,
she-
no,
can she-
wait, but that's a different question. Now we are not talking. Well, that's an important difference. Yeah? There's first the question, what are the relevant criteria? Is it really true that freedom and determinism are compatible? That depends on the criteria of freedom. And I tried to show that indeterminism is not such a criterion. The other question is, how do we find out that those criteria are met? That's a different question. So how do we find out that the woman in Iran was in control of her desire to wear, they don't wear burqa.
Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, Saudi Arabia or Afghanistan. Yeah,
Also,
right, yeah.
you have to
But that's a different question. If I wouldn't be able, I think I am, so there are not we, but some scientists at my brain school, they make experiments on addiction. And you can find out whether or not a person is addicted. For instance, if you show very, very short slides where the subject of your addiction is presented, then you have a specific kind of reaction that can be. So there are ways, but that's really a different question. Yeah, the question: how do we find out whether or not a specific person is addicted or is not in control of a certain desire, and is freedom compatible with determinism? I was only talking about the latter question. So you were asking for a long time.
Yeah. So maybe I can help you, or maybe you will kill me.
I'm not going to kill you.
In the moment, it's it's a kind of misty situation between all these beliefs and my decision. But if you get it, typically, so I'm thankful for Dostoevsky, a good novelist will show the inner monologue, what's going on with pro and con and pro and con from day to day, and then you realize, of course, we have an informal hierarchy of beliefs. So the woman in wherever will make, or maybe you're a hippie and say, I don't make now a career. Yeah? So your decision to make a career is changing your belief weight, and you say, okay, I will now I don't want to have this silly belief of stealing is okay, and now I want to have another belief, and so you control yourself like someone who's addicted and says, I want to control my addiction and fails, for instance, and so it's a very dynamic process.
No, that's true, yeah.
So isn't it about going into this point that there's indeed a kind of hierarchy with interacting beliefs? Else, it's a kind of logical causalism, if you want. So don't kill me, because your stream of consciousness is just one after another, and even if you have maybe two thoughts at once, it feels like, and this is the basic intuition of the determinist, that of course in the end it is determined by yourself. And so it's a paradox that if you understand it's your self-determination, it can, in the perspective, at the same time feel that it is not free. So this is a paradox we have not.
Why should it?
I give you an example. You are in a cave with a psychopath, and he says, I will kill you if you get the wrong of my hands. You will live if you get the stone in the right hand. And you have 24 hours, and you will think back and forth what will be left or right, left or right. So it has nothing to do with beliefs about what will happen, but you feel totally responsible about deciding about your life.
No, I don't think that this is. I mean, psychologically this might be true, but if we go, it wouldn't be justified, because I mean, there's no reason that I have to choose one hand over the other. So that's not a reasonable decision. I might feel so. That's
we're moving away from like
right.
as the basis
Yeah,
psychology.
Exactly. To make it more clear, what I mean is that this is what I would call absolute freedom, and the other is related to cognitive processes, and then is in a sense relative freedom, because it's an interaction of beliefs, arguments, pro and con, and then coming to a decision and being responsible for this. Yeah. This is more on a social layer and a self-understanding of myself. But the question between neural interaction or neural determination for me is more in the question of absolute freedom. Like I decide, and this is what's happening. And
I mean, this example that you gave, I mean, it's like a bit like Bouillin's Esel, so where you have no reasons to choose one option over the other. And that, I wouldn't say that I'm really free in this situation, because there's nothing, there's no real decision I can make. That's just mere chance event. Yeah, I might be right or wrong. There's freedom in some relevant sense if I really have reasons to make one choice over the other. Yeah, and that may be very difficult, and in some cases my beliefs and my desires might be incompatible with each other. I might have incoherent beliefs and desires, but that's the way it is. And of course, you're completely right. If I change one belief, then of course the whole system of my beliefs might change. That's certainly true. And it might also change in a way that I cannot predict or cannot foresee. That's certainly true. And that might interfere with my ability to act freely. So some psychological mechanism. That's certainly true. So I think I have to take stock of. I think, didn't you want to ask a question? No. Okay.
What I'd like to suggest is that so there seems to be some way to bring these two things together. So on the one hand, the identity between brain states and mental states, and on the other hand, this discussion around freedom determinism. Is there a point of indeterminism? And perhaps you
I would like to keep them separate in a certain sense, because I think if I would, I don't think that my beliefs about freedom or my theory of freedom depends on what I think about consciousness. That's one of the reasons why you haven't heard anything about consciousness in this idea of freedom that I presented to you.
I thought
what I tried to show
you were going to say that the beliefs, if you like, are like the brain states. So you have all these brain states which should, if you have an identity theory between acts
right.
and brain states, they should have a one-to-one correlation.
Okay, that's
what I thought was one way of bringing them together.
Yeah, right. Yeah, of course. I mean, they're compatible with each other, but they don't depend on each other. They're compatible such that I think
they're not
that
identical. That's why I asked that question earlier.
yeah, no, that's.
Well, they might be.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
remember, you want to ask a question, so you don't have to show this. I just answer this question. So I think both theories are compatible with each other. So the theory of freedom is compatible with the idea that mental states are realized by brain states, and it's compatible with the idea that the mental states might be determined. Personally, I don't think that brain states are determined, but that's another question. Yeah. If they are not, then this wouldn't enhance my ability to act freely. But nothing depends on it. And they are also compatible such that I think both consciousness and freedom are what I call natural abilities or natural capabilities. And that means they can be realized by natural activities or natural properties in your brain. It may be true that they are not. It may be true that I have an immaterial soul. I don't believe this, but that would go hand in hand or would be compatible with what I thought about freedom. And it would also follow that these abilities come in degrees, in different degrees. So there may be different degrees of consciousness. You may be more or less conscious, and there are also degrees of being free or being able to act in a self-determined manner. And that means particularly that you are more or less in control of your own beliefs and desires. So that's how they are compatible with each other. I think you were the next one.
Yeah, I wanted to say that maybe when we, in my own opinion, I think that somebody would be free if he would be able to distinguish between his desires and his beliefs, and he would be able to identify his beliefs as not identical with his desires.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I think that the beliefs are something that are something external. Maybe this is a reason why we're talking about this belief thing so much, because it's unclear what exactly is meant by beliefs. I mean, this can be socializing.
Yeah.
It could be religion. It could be when you don't steal because your flatmates may change your mind, and then you have adapted another belief because of the system you're moving in when you're in your flat. So it's just an external thing, and
I don't think that this is true. So I don't think if you really acquire beliefs. So for example, if somebody, what would be a good example? If somebody tells me something about, let's think about whether or not you take a train when you want to go something. You want to go to Hamburg and you ask yourself, well, should I take the car or should I take the train? And you used to believe that it's better to take the train, let's say, because for environmental reasons. And then you come across a study that the energy consumption of trains isn't so much better, it might be even worse than the one of cars. And if you then change your belief, let's assume there is some evidence because there's so much infrastructure that trains need, so, and they are almost empty, and so they need a lot of energy. Let's assume that this is true. Then you should be able, if you really understand those arguments, you evaluate those arguments on the basis of everything else you know, and then you start to accept this argument and change your belief that it's better to take the train. Yeah? that is something I don't think this comes from outside. It depends on your own process of evaluation, on your all the experience that you make and all the things you think are important. That's why I think it's not something.
That's a free decision, so to say.
That's why I think it's just not. That's not a free decision. Yeah, of course. If it would be a decision, I don't think that I make decisions whether or not I acquire a belief. Yeah, I think that's a cognitive process, and then I make a free decision when I, in this case, take the car rather than the train. Yeah, that would be a decision. But that's a question of definition. I don't think it's really important. You could also say I would be happy with saying, well, it's a decision to acquire this belief. But the important question is that's not something that comes from outside. It's completely different than, for instance, to contract a disease or something like that. Yeah? You really evaluate whether or not you should accept.
But then you're talking about information, and this is not what I was talking about.
Not only information processing and
belief
evaluation.
Too irrational. Belief sounded to me too irrational to be part of a pure decision.
Yeah, what do you think? What do you understand? So belief is just holding something to be true or to be right.
Because of factors you can't not overlook anymore. Because of factors that you don't, you can't overlook anymore. Because of reasons you can't tell, and because of systems you're moving in, because of other groups, because of things that happened before you was born.
Right.
And this is my point is that this all has nothing to do with an undetermined decision. This must be left by your side. So even a decision which when you take a decision and you don't and you act against your, or you take the decision to act against your beliefs, and you could realize that this is free decision, undetermined. This is so.
What does it mean to act against your belief? I think it's necessary that if it turns out that my beliefs are false, or that I have reasons to give up one belief, that I make a different decision, that's true. But deciding against your belief, that's something that sounds very strange to me. I think it's completely wrong to drive 100 kilometers in front of a kindergarten. Yeah? But then it would be free if I would be able to do this, actually do this. And I think that doesn't have anything to do with my freedom. That would be just a random event. It actually would interfere with what I think is a really self-determined decision, because it goes against my beliefs and my desires. Yeah, so, but I should be able to change those beliefs and desires if I think
based
I have
on other beliefs.
Exactly, yeah. And everything else would be, why would we say this is my decision to change the belief and desire? Yeah? So I think could somebody else share the session? So I'm not sure that I'm a very good share. I think you were the next, and then you, unless you have a short remark on self